Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will and also explores cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Seay.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Barbara Vetter about abilities and how we come to know what abilities we have.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Barbara Vetter, Professor of Theoretical Philosophy at the Free University of Berlin and co-director of Human Abilities, which is a Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities project funded by the DFG. Barbara works primarily in metaphysics and related areas of epistemology, the philosophy of language, of action, and of science. She's the author of a book called Potentiality, From Dispositions to Modality, published by Oxford University Press in 2015. And she's also working on a new book, which I just learned is forthcoming with Oxford University Press, which is tentatively titled Modal Knowledge and Action, although she's circulated it on her website under a different title previously, like I think it was Agency and Possibility. And in that book, she's going to be continuing to explore the epistemology of modality, beginning with our knowledge of our abilities. And we're going to talk about that project today. So welcome to the show, Barbara. Thanks for joining us. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to abilities?
Yeah. Hi, Taylor and Matt. Thank you so much for having me here. Well, as you already said, I'm a professor of theoretical philosophy at the Free University in Berlin, and I've been there for almost 10 years now. So I started out really in the metaphysics of modality, and I can sort of trace the roots of my work there and the first book that you mentioned, Potentiality, to two things. One was that as a grad student already, I was really dissatisfied with philosophers talking of possible worlds all the time. Like whenever any problem comes up, you say, well, imagine a possible world in which... And that felt to me like something was just gone wrong, although it took me a long time to sort of point to exactly what I thought had gone wrong. And I don't have a philosophical argument against doing that kind of thing, but it felt to me that we sort of lost something of importance. Like when we think about modal things, what could we have done? Could we have acted otherwise, since this is the Free Will podcast? It's one of the really big questions to do with possibility, right? We're really interested in the here and now and in the, well, maybe here and yesterday, but anyway, in this world and in what's actually around us, and not in some other possible world that might then be, abstract constructions out of propositions or even concrete parallel universes a la Lewis. So something seemed to me to have gone wrong, not with sort of appealing to possible worlds at all. I mean, they are a very potent formal model, and I have absolutely no problem with that, but we're thinking that somehow helps us answer the deeper questions of metaphysics, was what I was interested in at the time. The other source gave me a sort of alternative, which was that I'd been reading a lot of Aristotle as a grad student, and I was really impressed by Aristotle's metaphysics, where he uses the notion of potentiality like a lot. It's one of the central notes. I mean, anybody who's read Aristotle knows that potentiality is one of his core notions. It's right up there with form and matter and essence. He uses it to explain almost anything from change to the good life. And one book of his work, The Metaphysics, Book 9, or Theta, as it's sometimes called, just gives a really, really good, I think, account of potentiality and its counterpart, actuality. It's kind of difficult how to translate it. So I'd been reading my Aristotle. I'd been sort of unhappy about people talking of possible worlds. And then I took some time off and I read some Leibniz. And there Leibniz went and said, look, all this new science is well and good, but don't throw out all the scholasticism. Actually, we still have place for powers in the scientific worldview. I mean, this is early modern times. He appealed to forces in Newton. And I thought, yeah, that's it. So that was, I can really remember the moment where I thought, that's what I want to do. And so what I set out to do, and what ended up sort of being the book you mentioned, Potentiality, was really try to understand modality, possibility, necessity, that kind of stuff, in terms of something that's really here in this world. And that's more or less what Aristotle had in mind when he talked about potentiality. Now, lots of things have happened in philosophy since Aristotle. We've learned a lot more about the powers of things in the world. We don't think that there are 4 elements with distinctive powers.
Right.
There's a lot more to be said, and there's really interesting discussions, say, in philosophy of science about dispositions and laws of nature, which is something Aristotle never thought about. There's modal semantics, which thinks about how we talk about modality and so on and so forth. And there's modal logic, obviously, which has made a lot of progress in the 20th century. And so what I sort of tried to do was to sort of see how we can get this Aristotelian idea of potentiality, as it were, up to date with our contemporary worldview and with all the kinds of resources we have today. So that's really where I'm coming from in metaphysics, and I still really care about it. I'm still convinced the world is full of potentiality, and that's sort of all the possibilities we need. And then after I finished the book and some sort of little spin-off projects from that, I think part of the motivation there, and maybe something that you see in some parts of metaphysics, but not necessarily in others, was a kind of concern that even very abstract metaphysics still has something to do with human concerns, right? That was the whole motivation why I wasn't so keen on talking about possible worlds.
Right.
And I guess in the past 10 years or so, I've sort of moved more towards the more human side of things, which then takes me to the kind of potentialities or powers that are characteristic of humans, maybe not just humans, but definitely of humans. And that's where the abilities come in. Those are the potentials or powers that really define who we are and that make a big difference to us in our lives. And it was very lucky for me that just when I started at the Free University, a colleague at sort of our sister university here in Berlin, the Humboldt University, and I applied to run this Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities that you mentioned, called Human Abilities, where the idea was that we would bring together people from different areas of philosophy. So my colleague and co-director, Dominik Perler, is a historian of philosophy who works on medieval and early modern. I obviously work in contemporary philosophy, though, as you've already gathered, I also like the history.
Right.
And we felt that the topic of abilities was a really good focal topic to bring different areas together. It's been really important in the history of philosophy. And one of the things that happens between medieval and early modern philosophy is that kind of rejection of people in early modern times of precisely the Aristotelian talk of potentialities and faculties of the soul and all that, although they kind of keep doing it, but pretend not to. And so it's a really interesting topic to engage with different parts of the history of philosophy, but also it comes up, for me in metaphysics, when you talk about free will, in philosophy of action, in epistemology, in ethics, philosophy of education. So it's really an area that brings, a topic that brings different areas and subdisciplines of philosophy together in where they hadn't really been talking to each other so much, reinventing the wheel all over the place.
Right.
And so we founded this center with the aim of bringing people together around this topic. And that's been incredibly useful for my own work because I've just had so many wonderful people to talk to.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, as you said, the notion of ability is central to what you're doing right now. So we want to ask you more about abilities. It might be helpful first to talk about a label that you use in some of your work called agentive modality. So what is modality in general, and what is agentive modality in particular?
Yeah, thank you very much. I should say right away that the label agentive modality is one that I haven't invented. I took it from John Mayer, and I think it's been popularized through some work in semantics, mostly a paper by Matt Mandelker, Ginger Schultheis, and David Boylan. So thanks to those people, because it's a really useful label. But I'll start with the beginning of your question. So when we talk about modality in philosophy, we usually mean possibility and necessity. That's really sort of the core two notions. Sometimes we throw in contingency, where something's contingent if it is one way but could have been another way. Sometimes people throw in counterfactual conditionals. If this had been the case, then that would have been the case. But those are thrown in mostly because they're closely related to necessity and possibility. Okay. Right. Now, in standard treatments of modality, in philosophy, we think of modality, necessity, and possibility as sentence operators that have a sort of distinctive and well-defined logic, or, a range of distinctive and well-defined logics, depending on exactly what you do. So they're sentence operators. They always operate on a whole sentence. It is possible that, it is necessary that, and then you can fill in a whole sentence. So it's possible that it rains later today. There we have the sentence, it rains later today. It's necessary that 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 = 4 is a whole sentence. So this is how these operators work. And then we have a whole logic for them that comes with certain distinctive axioms and different systems that sort of add extra axioms on top of those. Now, when we think about modality outside of logic, we don't very often say it is possible that and it is necessary that. The way we usually express modality in language is with modal auxiliaries like can and must, or maybe adjectives, maybe, that kind of stuff. And so I like to say modality is anything that has to do with what can and must be, which I find a slightly more accessible definition. I mean, it's not really a definition, but sort of characterization.
Yeah.
Now, agentive. So I hope that's enough about modality
great.
to get us started. Now, agentive modality, the way people got to the topic was, I think, really in semantics. So we can think about words that we use for modality and actual language words. So not the philosophers' operators, box and diamond, which we use for necessarily and possibly in modal logic, but really the ordinary language can and must. And so people who started talking about agentive modality started out by noticing again a fact that had been noticed before, but hadn't really been at the center of attention so much, that certain sentences with can don't seem to behave in the way that you'd expect a modal operator to behave coming from modal logic. Maybe I should go one step back. So when we do modal semantics, we usually do it in the tradition of Angelika Kratzer, who's like one of the big linguists. And the big insight in Angelika Kratzer is that we can understand the ordinary language expressions like can and must in terms of the sentence operators from modal logic. So we can understand can as meaning possibly, and then all the weird stuff that happens with can is just sort of stuff that we can explain with the resources we have in modal logic. Now, some people think that that's not always true, and that in particular, when you have a can and you stick an agent and an action in, like Barbara can ride a bicycle, then things happen that don't really fit into what we know from modal logic. So the person who's famous for noticing this actually quite a while back was Anthony Kenny. And I'll just give you Kenny's examples because I think they're really important for the debate. So you'd think that can just means possibly. Obviously, it doesn't mean necessarily, right? So we'll forget about necessarily, we'll just think about possibly. Now, one thing that the possibility operator gives you in any modal logic that's at all well-behaved, so-called normal modal logic that you can model with quantifying over possible worlds, is distribution over disjunction. So if it's possible that P or Q, then it must be possible that P or possible that Q. So if disjunction is possible, then at least one of the disjuncts must be. If it's possible that it rains or snows, but it's not possible that it rains or possible that it snows, that can't happen, right? So it's at least one possible too. Okay. Now, Kenny says that's not true of can if we use can to ascribe abilities. So he imagines you're faced with a stack of cards that are sort of upside down, so you can't see which cards there are. You just see the back. And all the cards are either red or black. So here's something you can do. You can pick a red card or pick a black card. Because by picking a card, you're going to be doing one of these two things. Right. So you have no problem making the disjunction true. But can you pick a red card or can you pick a black card? Well, you might think neither, because you can just pick a card. You don't have, you can't. Yeah. It's going to be random which one it is. So it seems that whereas possibility really, really has to distribute over disjunction, ability doesn't. Also, Kenny concludes. Second thing, not every kind of possibility, but sort of every kind of possibility that has any claim to being like ability goes by so-called axiom T, and axiom T phrased with possibility just means whatever's actual is possible. That's a pretty solid principle in modal logic. I mean, unless you're dealing with deontic modality, but never mind about that. So anything that's actually the case is also possibly the case. Sure, it's actual, so how could it be impossible?
Right.
Again, Kenny argues that's not true of ability. And his example here is a darts player. So he says a hopeless darts player may once in a lifetime hit the bull's eye. So it could be me. I've never played darts, so I might just pick up a dart and throw it and just, it could land anywhere, might land on the bull's eye. Does it follow that I can, in the sort of ability sense, hit the bullseye? No. It was just a fluke. It was just random. I got lucky. It wasn't ability. It was just luck. Okay. And so again, ability does not seem to have the kind of logic that you'd expect of a modality that is anything like possibility. Mm-hmm. So I've used can. Other agentive modals generally related. There's cannot, obviously the negation. There is also cannot but, which is sometimes called a compulsion modal and should behave a bit like a necessity, but again, sort of doesn't. And so this kind of discussion, starting with Kenny, and it has been taken up in sort of more recent literature by the people I've already mentioned in semantics, seems to show that abilities, that these agentive modals, the agent can act kind of constructions, that they're different from just possibilities. And so whatever is distinctive of these cases, that's what we mean by agentive modality. And agentive just because it's clearly so closely connected to action. And I think one plausible hypothesis is that what sets them apart from mere possibilities is that we have some kind of control. Possibility has nothing to do with control, but agentive modals have something to do with control. Yeah, and so that's what agentive modality is about.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, perhaps the most important agentive modality is one you've already hinted at, ability. So what is an ability, and are there any basic distinctions between sorts of abilities that would be helpful to keep in mind?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, obviously I've hinted very, very strongly at ability because I think it is the crucial notion of agentive modality. So what abilities are properties of agents that provide them with some amount of control over what to do. I think that's how I would characterize an ability in the abstract, not a reductive definition, but a characterization. Sure. Loads and loads of examples. I've already given you one. I can ride a bike. That's an ability I have. I can speak English, as I'm sure you can tell, but I can't speak Spanish, for instance. I can speak German. You probably can't, although we haven't tried, and so on. So we have all these kinds of abilities. I can raise my hand. I mean, this comes up a lot in the free will debate. You can raise your arm. Could you have raised your arm when you didn't? That kind of thing. Okay, so abilities are properties of agents. That makes them a lot like dispositions. Dispositions are properties of individuals, and agents have dispositions too. So non-agents also. The glass that I'm drinking my water from is fragile. It has a disposition to break. I also have all kinds of dispositions, like I might be disposed to eat a piece of chocolate when it's placed in front of me. Really difficult. I might be. This is not true of me, but some people are disposed to get angry very easily. That's irascibility is a classic disposition. So agents have dispositions too, and abilities differ from those dispositions in that they provide agents with some sort of control. I mean, what makes the chocolate or the irascibility case not an ability but a disposition is precisely that it seems something happening to us rather than something we control. That's sort of that's one thing, one kind of maybe useful contrast. Another maybe useful contrast is that between ability and opportunity. So let's suppose I'm actually pretty bad at it, but I can kind of play the piano, and that's an ability I have, but there's no piano here. I'm in my office. I think there's no piano in the whole building, so I don't have an opportunity to play the piano. So abilities contrast with opportunities in that abilities are properties of the agent, whereas opportunities tend to be properties of the environment. So we have these two contrasts. Dispositions are also properties of the agent, for instance, but they don't have that control element. Opportunities sort of help us with our control, but they're out in the environment. They're not properties of agents. Okay, so that's what I think abilities are. You asked me for distinctions. Well, like any philosopher, I can give you a long list of distinctions.
Right.
I'll give you just a few. So one distinction, I'm not even sure if that's a distinction between kinds of abilities, but it's still important to draw it out. So sometimes philosophers talk about simple ability, and simple ability is basically defined precisely as an ability that doesn't do the thing I was just talking about with respect to agentive modality. So a simple ability is supposed to be the kind of ability that you have if you just succeed once.
Right.
Yeah.
And, there is a sense, if I do hit the bullseye, there is a sense in which it was true that I can hit it. I did, so I could. And there's also the famous example from David Lewis, where he said, when he talks about the ability to speak Finnish, and he says, compared to an ape, I can speak Finnish. I've got the larynx and the vocal cords and all that. But don't take me to Helsinki as your interpreter. I can't speak Finnish. Readings can, and you might think the first one is also something like a simple ability, and the second is the other side of the contrast doesn't really have a name. I like to call it a robust ability, although robust means all kinds of things.
Right.
Now, it's just words. When I say ability, I don't mean simple ability. I want to call simple abilities just something, maybe they're just possibilities. I think very often in these cases, there's some sort of ability stuff in the background. So I can hit the bullseye. I have the ability to throw a dart.
Right.
It's just that I can't control whether or not it hits the bullseye. Or in the Lewis case, I don't have the ability to speak Finnish, but I have the ability to learn it. So maybe there's some sort of more complicated ability stuff going on in the background in these so-called simple ability cases. And they're interesting, but they're sort of not what I mean when I talk about abilities. So that's a distinction I'm drawing just to set one side of the distinction aside and focus on robust abilities or abilities proper. Another really important distinction is the distinction between general and specific abilities, where you can think of a specific ability as something like ability plus opportunity, although it is very controversial in which direction the explanation goes. So I like to think that we come with our general abilities and then we add stuff in the world and get specific abilities. Other people think that they're specific abilities and then we generalize from them to get to general abilities. But I'll tell you what the distinction really is. So I already gave you the example. Let's suppose I have an ability to play the piano. I've had lessons. I've got all it takes. My fingers are in order. Nothing funny going on in my brain. I have the ability to play the piano. I can play the piano, but if you say, play the piano now, I have to say, well, I can't play the piano. There's no piano around. And so you might think in the first sentence, I can play the piano. I'm talking about my general abilities, which are supposed to be stable, typically intrinsic features of an agent. The intrinsicality thing is a bit complicated because there might be social conditions in the background that we just hold fixed. So maybe stability is more of a, it's a fuzzy distinction probably, but anyway, whereas specific abilities are abilities that take into account more of the, let's say, changing environment of the agents or just sort of more factors. So that's a really important distinction. And again, I keep coming back to free will because that's the name of your podcast. Obviously, that's a big debate about so-called new dispositionalism in the free will literature, right? Whether general abilities would be enough for free will or we need specific abilities, and whether determinism, it's pretty clear that determinism can't take away our general abilities, but sort of can we still have specific abilities in a deterministic world? So that's where this distinction, I think, is quite important. It's a slightly different distinction from a distinction that there's no really agreed upon labeling practice, but I like to take labels from Anne Whittle, who sometimes talks about local and global abilities. I don't think there's any reason in the words why we should use it that way, but that is a distinction not in sort of what it takes to possess the ability, but what the exercise consists in. So you might think of the ability to walk, and then there's the ability to walk on a steep surface, and then there's the ability to walk briskly on a steep surface, and so on and so forth. These get more and more local, whereas if it's just the ability to walk, that's pretty global. That's a slightly different distinction. So you put more specifications into what it is to exercise the ability, whereas general specific, you put more specifications into what it takes to possess the ability. Slightly different distinction, but can often be used to the same purposes. I can say more if you like.
That's super helpful. I remember even in grad school reading papers on abilities and just getting lost in some of this terminology, and the way you just laid out even the difference between specific and general abilities and then local global. That's so clear. That's so helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Well, another term you discuss under the umbrella of agentive modality is affordance.
Mm-hmm.
So could you tell us what you mean by affordance and how it relates to ability?
Yeah. I think I'll start with where I got the label from, because again, that's a label that I didn't make up, but I took over from others and then sort of did my own little thing with. So the term affordance is a term of art, and it was invented explicitly by ecological psychologist James Gibson and also Eleanor Gibson. Those were a couple, but also apparently close collaborators, has done a lot of work on it. And it's become really, really popular over the past 2 decades, I'd say. I mean, there's even work in architecture that talks about it. There's a lovely paper on social affordances that explains why women end up doing more housework. So there's really, I mean, it's all over the place. Back in Gibson, it was part of his very specific so-called ecological theory of perception, which very roughly sort of tries to move away from sort of looking at how light impinges on the retina and stuff like that, and thinks about perception at the level where the animal interacts with its environment. And Gibson points out that at that level, it's really crucial for animals to perceive these things he calls affordances, which is basically what you can do with things in your environment. Mm-hmm. So typical examples, if I look at my glass, I can see that it's graspable for me. So it's reachable because it's not too far away, but it's also graspable because it has the right kind of shape to put my hand around it. When I walk around, I can tell which objects are, and these are Gibson's own phrasings, I can see which objects are sit-onable. So basically, whenever you take an action verb and put an able in the end, you get an affordance. My keyboard is type-onable. My pen is right with, I don't know. Gibson also includes things that are sort of more passive. So he says you can see that a cliff is a falling off place, or it is fall-offable. So basically, and I think his general description is what the environment affords to the animal for good or ill. So that's why he calls it affordance. Mm-hmm. Now, Gibson obviously wasn't a metaphysician. He was a psychologist and interested in perception. So he didn't exactly give us an ontology of affordances. There's been some debate about it. And I think that's been sort of tied up in some sort of specific concerns of ecological psychology. In recent years, there's been some really good philosophical work on what affordances are. And one of the things that are really important to keep apart is that very often, but even as Gibson already pointed out, not necessarily, affordance perception can go along with perceiving something as not just doable, but to be done. Mm-hmm. So here's an example. I think it's from Susanna Siegel. She gives the example, while you're talking to someone, you can see that a tuft of hair has fallen into their face and it's sort of blocking their eye. And you could see that that's something, they could you could sort of put that aside to sort of look back into their eyes. And that can be either something you just register, that's a possibility, or you really feel compelled to do it. Right. Okay. Now, I think many of the interesting cases of affordance perception are of the second kind, where it's sort of really inviting, eliciting, you feel like, but it doesn't have to be that way. And for my purposes, I think it's useful to keep these two aspects apart. So when I talk about affordances, just because that's what I'm interested in, I sort of bracket that whole sort of inviting, eliciting, maybe quasi-normative aspect. And I'm really just thinking about what we can do with things. Mm-hmm. And to make that a bit more precise, or at least fit it in with my general framework, I've tried to just sort of regiment the term affordance. It doesn't mean other people have to use the word that way, but the way I'm using it, affordances are really just the counterpart on the side of the objects to the agent's affordances. Mm-hmm. So an object affords some action to me, just in case I have the ability to perform that action on the object. The glass is graspable for me just because I have the ability to grasp the glass. Now then you might think, why do we need notions of affordance when we can express it all in terms of abilities? I think we could, but it sometimes really makes it easier to sort of track it, as it were, anchored to the objects around us rather than to our own abilities. I can remember that I can ride on my bike, but I can also just remember that my bike affords riding. And then I can look at other bikes that are similar to it, and I can sort of just think about the property of my bike and then the properties of the other bikes without having to, as it were, explicitly think about my own properties. Yeah, I think the notion of affordance also helps us see how we might have perceptual access. It's kind of weird to say that we can perceive our own abilities out in the world, but of course we can perceive properties of the objects around us that are in some way relative to our abilities. And so talking about affordances also sort of ties it back nicely to the original idea in Gibson that we can perceive these properties in the world. And I find that very plausible.
Yeah. Well, this, to me, is maybe the most interesting part of the new book project, how much you're focused on modal epistemology. And so knowledge of our own, of agentive modality. It was fascinating to read about. So the next question is about that. Since you take knowledge of agentive modality to be foundational for our general knowledge of objective modality, you take it to be crucial to your argument that instances of agentive modality are paradigm cases of objective modality. And this is one of the bigger topics, I think, in the book, is sort of like contrasting objective views with non-objective ones. So can you say why someone might be tempted to treat agentive modality as not objective? And then can you say how you respond to that position?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start by saying a bit more about the labels. Again, although I am definitely not doing semantics, I take the excellent work that exists in semantics as a kind of starting point. So semanticists, linguists, and philosophers of language have distinguished between what's sometimes called different flavors of modal expressions. So modality can be epistemic, that's relative to our knowledge. And that happens, for instance, when, this is a typical example, a detective said, Mary might have been there and there at the time of the crime. It's just sort of, we can't rule it out given what we know.
Yeah.
There's deontic modals. They have to do with, all kinds of normative stuff, obligations and permissions and so on. And so if I tell my kid, you can go out and play now, I'm giving a permission, and the can here is just saying something about what they're allowed to do. That's the deontic modality. And then the third category is the category there's sort of further, distinctions, but that's the standard sort of three-part distinction. The third category or third flavor is the one that I'm always the most interested in. And linguists sometimes call that circumstantial, sometimes dynamic, sometimes priority modal, sometimes even ability. Anyway, so I use the philosopher's term objective modality. And this is the kind of modality we express when we want to say what really can happen in the world, as in when I say, the glass can break or it can rain later today. Okay, so that's objective modality. That's got something to do with how the world really can go and not with what we know or what should be the case and so on. So the controversial claim I'm trying to defend in the book that you mentioned is that ability is, for our thought, the most basic kind of objective modality. Okay, this is not meant to be a claim about metaphysics. I don't think abilities are sort of a primitive thing in the world, but I do think they're sort of primitive in our thinking about modality, objective modality, that is. And so they really should be objective. So your question was, why might that be challenged?
Yeah.
I think the main challenge comes from things that are sort of known in philosophy, kind of like the Knope effect. So the Knope effect, as you guys know, but the Knope effect is sort of happens when judgments about apparently descriptive matters sort of get infected by normative things, where we judge intentional action or causation differently when it ends up good or bad, or when we want to blame people or praise them. And so it's kind of like that, a bit different, but we seem to get this sort of, I think in a nice paper by Knope and somebody else, I think Jonathan Phillips, called modals with a taste of the deontic. So we get a taste of the deontic in ability modals as well. And one of the cases that you find, for instance, in the Mandel-Kern, Schultheis and Boylan paper, is we say things like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't go to the cinema with you tonight. I'm already meeting somebody else for dinner. Now, if we read that, that's kind of an agentive can. It's not a possibility can, but it's not. Of course I can, right? It's not that it's out of my control. I could just cancel my other plans and go to the cinema with you tonight. I can't go to the cinema with either of you tonight because we're on different continents. But and so there seems to be some kind of deontic thing in there, which is, I'm sort of just ruling out possibilities that I don't want or that I think would be bad, like canceling my plans with the other friend who's relying on me. So there seems to be something a bit deontic in there. Now, I think the response to that is actually quite simple, which is, yeah, the semantics is really complicated, and ability modals, like all kinds of other modal expressions, do get a sort of taste of the deontic. But it was really easy to answer to that. Well, of course I could. So, with a moment of reflection, we can tell these things apart. Right. And it's easy to explain why we do mix them together, because usually when we say something about abilities, it's in the course of either sort of seeing what our options for action are, or maybe, again, this is where the free will context comes in, thinking about what we could have done differently and then assigning responsibility. And these are precisely the kinds of cases where deontic considerations matter just as much as considerations about our abilities. And so if I'm just thinking about what to do tonight, there's no point in sort of thinking purely about what I can do and then thinking about what I should do. I can just rule out my abilities to do the things I shouldn't or don't want to do, right? And then just look at those. So what I want to say here is that we really should distinguish between the semantics, where things can be mixed together for good practical reasons, and the sort of more, well, the metaphysics, obviously, but even also our capacity to think about these things. Because, as I said, I think it's pretty easy for us to say, well, of course I can. It's just that, that's not right. Yeah.
Some of your recent works has focused on issues in modal epistemology, and we've talked a lot about what modality is, but could you explain what modal epistemology is?
Gladly. So modal epistemology is just that part of epistemology where we wonder not just about our knowledge in general, but our knowledge of modality. So it's the epistemology of modality. The main question is, how do we know what's possible and what's necessary? Now, that's a pretty puzzling question, because we seem to know all kinds of stuff about what's possible and what's necessary, but how? I mean, most of our ways of acquiring knowledge are sort of keyed to what's actual, right? So basic case, I mean, I've already given you affordances, so that makes it more complicated. But, prima facie, you'd think perception gives us access to what's actual. And then reasoning from perception by induction or inference of the best explanation or whatever kinds of reasoning we have at our disposal, that probably sort of stays within the realm of what's actually the case. It doesn't give us access to what's merely possible or what's not, what couldn't have been otherwise. So empirical knowledge, really difficult. Maybe we have a priori access to modality. Well, a priori knowledge is always really tricky. We know since Kripke that necessity and a priority do come apart, so we'd have to have some more complicated story. So basically, it's just one of these cases where we seem to have knowledge, and it's kind of difficult to explain how.
Yeah.
This becomes especially pressing for philosophers, because a lot of philosophy makes claims about what's merely possible, mostly about what's metaphysically possible. Or rather, most claims in many areas of philosophy are claims that are meant to be necessarily true. And so rule out all kinds of possibilities. And then we give counterexamples to these claims by saying, but it's possible that blah, blah, blah. And then so it can't be necessary. So we philosophers deal with possibilities and necessities all the time. And, if we like to have any claim to knowing what we're saying, we'd better have a story where it turns out we can know about possibility and necessity. Okay. Now, so one big question is, how do we know? We might also think there's a second big question, which is, well, and what do we know? I mean, do we know all these things about possibility and necessity? And what I find very helpful here is a paper by Peter van Inwagen that's maybe 30 years old. It's just called Modal Epistemology. Van Inwagen there defends a view that he calls modal skepticism. So it sounds like he says we don't know anything about modality, but that's actually not what he says. So he distinguishes between, I think he calls it nearby and remote possibilities, or close by. Anyway, and his comparison is with the case of vision. He says, we can see pretty well things that are close by, nothing wrong with our powers of vision, but once things are too far away, that's just not covered
Right.
by our perceptual capacities anymore. And maybe it's a bit like that with modality. We're doing pretty well with, in possible worlds talk, the nearby possible worlds. We know all kinds of stuff, like all the things I've mentioned. It could rain later. Also all kinds of could have stuff. John F. Kennedy could have lived longer, I think, is one of his examples. So it's not that we don't know anything about possibility and necessity. We know a lot, and he doesn't have anything to say about how we know about it. What he's skeptical about is the sort of more remote kinds of possibilities and necessities. Is it possible that there are philosophical zombies? Is it possible that there is transparent iron? Is it possible those kinds of things that metaphysicians debate? And that's where he's a skeptic. Now, I find his paper very useful, not because I am a skeptic about knowledge of metaphysical modality, but I do think the distinction is really important. And I think we have, but this is me now, this is not general modal epistemology. I think we have very different explanatory tasks in modal epistemology. When it comes to the sort of everyday nearby possibilities, I think the task really is to explain, given that we do know those things, how does it work? What's the underlying mechanism? What are the capacities we're using? When it comes to the more remote things we debate in metaphysics, I feel that the task of modal epistemology is a more sort of prescriptive one. It's how could we ever come to know things like that? Because, we can't agree on which of these claims are true, claims of metaphysical possibility and necessity. So it's really difficult to see who knows any of them. And then if we don't know who knows, it's sort of tricky to find out how they know, because half of us at least are going to be wrong. So I think in the case of these more remote or metaphysical modalities or modal facts, the task of modal epistemology might be a bit different, not to explain the knowledge we evidently have, but to sort of help us see how we could get knowledge in an area like that.
Yeah. That's great.
That's my own idiosyncratic view of the field.
Well, you also argue that current work in modal epistemology doesn't account for knowledge of abilities. So can you say what sort of approaches already exist in modal epistemology and how you take issue with them?
Yeah. So when I introduced agentive modality earlier, I said that when philosophers think of modality, they generally think of necessity and possibility, sentence operators, well-defined logic, all that stuff. And when you look at work in modal epistemology, that's also what people focus on. And, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that's why knowledge of our own abilities can't really be, or general knowledge of ability can't be accommodated very well, because it induces us to think that ability knowledge is just a sort of special case of our knowledge of necessities or possibilities. And because abilities are so different from possibility and necessity, I think that doesn't work. Yeah, so I'll give you a bit of a lay of the land, although obviously I'm going to have to leave out things. Modal epistemology, as we have it, is standardly partitioned into sort of rationalist and empiricist approaches, though interestingly, the actual empiricists would have been modal rationalists, I think, at least. So modal rationalism says that our modal knowledge has to be, rationalist in the sense that it's not knowledge we get from input that we get from the world, but something that we do in our minds. Could be something like a priori conceivability. David Chalmers is famous for that. Could also be something like rational intuition and so on, which you find in all kinds of other authors. I'm going to set that aside pretty quickly because I'm pretty sure that a priori conceivability or rational intuition isn't going to tell us what our abilities are, for the simple fact that our abilities are pretty contingent and we really need to try. I mean, how would I know that I can walk but not fly? I mean, I need to have some experience of the body I have, the kinds of movements that work and don't. So whatever the promise of rationalist modal epistemology, I think it's kind of a non-starter for ability knowledge. So I'm going to focus on the so-called empiricist approaches, which think that our modal knowledge has something to do with the kind of input we get from the world. I'm not sure. Well, okay. So here's one empiricist approach. That's definitely, I think, self-labeled empiricist. So one way to think about modal epistemology is like this. We know a lot of what's actually true, obviously, just by observation. And if we have any concept of possibility at all, at least if it's an objective possibility concept, we'll know that the T axiom holds. I mean, we may not be able to say that explicitly, but we'll be inclined to infer from actuality to possibility. And so whenever I see something actually happen and I have a concept of objective possibility, I can infer that that thing possibly happened. Now, that's kind of boring possibility knowledge because I already know it's actual. But once I know that this thing possibly happened, I can then use some sort of empirical method like induction, analogical reasoning, to think of other things really similar to it and infer that they also possibly happen. So Sonia Rocker-Royes has a sort of very common sense example. I think it's common sense, although I don't think it happens very often. She says, my previous desk, Messi, has broken. I don't know, my desks have never broken, but who knows? So she has a desk that broke, and so she can infer that possibly that particular desk, Messi, has broken. Now she bought a new desk that looks just like the old one, same, bought it in the same store and so on. And so since the original desk, Messi, has broken, and the new desk, Messi 2, is, relevantly like it, she can infer that that new desk also possibly breaks. Okay. Now, I like that kind of approach because it's nice and empiricist and really down to earth, and it really sort of starts with what we know about the world. Mm-hmm. I don't think it works for abilities for the very simple fact that I've mentioned earlier. Ability is an agentive modality, and agentive modality just doesn't have the T axiom, and so the inference doesn't work, or at least it doesn't quite work in that way. When I hit the bullseye once, I just can't infer that I have the ability, and so I can't infer that you have the ability either.
Right.
I mean, there's something a bit like the T axiom that I'll get to when I tell you about my own approach, but just as it stands, I think this approach doesn't work because its crucial part is a logical axiom for possibility that just doesn't hold for ability. The other approach that I think looks promising, and that is sometimes classified as empiricist, sometimes not, but definitely not a standard rationalist account, is a modal epistemology that begins with the counterfactual conditional. If this had been the case, that would have been the case. I guess that's mostly famous from the work of Tim Williamson. Thomas Krödel has also done some excellent work on this. And so here the idea is we have, again, very sort of common sense knowledge of counterfactuals. So Tim Williamson's example is you're on a hike and suddenly a rock starts rolling down and it sort of ends up, there's a bush and that sort of, the rock gets stuck in the bush. And then you can ask yourself, oh, where would the rock have gone if the bush hadn't been there? Mm-hmm. And we can figure that out. We're pretty good at that. Mm-hmm. And there are all, I think Tim Williamson has a view where there's different cognitive capacities that we can use in order to figure this out. Imagination is very important if it's properly constrained. There's the idea that you can sort of run your cognitive processes offline. So you sort of start with what you saw from the rock and then run that in your head, but sort of removing the bush, as it were, and then sort of see where it goes. So there are all kinds of accounts of how we have this kind of knowledge, of how we get to have this knowledge of counterfactuals. And that's at least very empirically informed. And so in that sense, maybe it gets the label modal empiricist. And I think that's all fine. And you might think that's great because abilities are a lot like counterfactuals. In fact, people have tried to analyze abilities in terms of counterfactuals. I didn't say that when you asked me about ability. Mm-hmm. So, and again, the free will literature is the place where this happened. So the famous analysis going back to G.E. Moore in 1912 says to have an ability to do something, to have an ability to A, is to be such that the following counterfactual holds. If you try to A, or if you choose to A, or if you decide to A, then you would A. Mm-hmm. Sorry, that wasn't a counterfactual conditional. Let me say it again. So the very famous analysis going back at least to G.E. Moore in 1912 states that to have an ability to do something is to be such that the following counterfactual holds. If you tried to do it, or decided or chose to do it, then you would do it. So, for instance, my ability to ride the bicycle is just a matter of my riding a bicycle whenever I try, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. The counterfactual doesn't have to be necessarily equivalent to the ability in order to be useful in learning about what we're able to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's true, but it definitely can't be the whole story. And the reason for that is actually a counterexample that comes from the literature on conditional analysis of abilities. So one counterexample to the Moorian analysis is as follows. It might be that you have some pathological condition where you can't even try to do a thing. So if you're a terrible arachnophobic, you might not be able to get yourself to even try to touch a spider. Now, if you could get yourself to try to do it, your motor systems are okay. So if you ever get to try, you'll do it.
Mm-hmm.
No problem.
Yeah.
What's really holding you back is that you can't try.
Right.
But then it feels like you really can't touch a spider because you can't even try, right? But it's still true that if you tried, you would. So counterfactual, true, ability, ascription, false, not equivalent. As I said, non-equivalence is not a problem for the epistemological project, but I think it does tell us something. You could know all the counterfactuals you like about what you would do if you tried. If you didn't know that you have an ability to try, you wouldn't know anything about your abilities.
Mm-hmm.
So knowing counterfactuals can certainly expand your ability knowledge. If I already know I can do the one thing, and that if I were to do the one thing, I would do the other thing, I know I can do the other thing. But you have to put some ability knowledge in order to get ability knowledge out of your knowledge of counterfactuals. And that's why I think that particular account doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll very briefly just end with my diagnosis of what's gone wrong there.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I said, these approaches we have focus on the kinds of modalities that we're familiar with: possibility, necessity, the counterfactual, conditional, and abilities are just different from those. And abilities are different in ways that make philosophers queasy. They're really messy. We don't really know what the logical principles are. There's this sort of control element that who knows how control works? There are historical papers on it, but it's nothing like the beautiful world of modal logic. And so, in a sense, possibility and necessity are the clean and simple concepts, and you might think that's where we should get started. Now, I think conceptually and philosophically that's a good idea, but when we think about how human beings actually work and how our cognitive capacities actually work, that can't be true. We don't start with the clean and simple concepts. Here's a parallel case. The universal quantifier, lovely, clean and simple. That's, you can give a set theoretic semantics for that. We know exactly what follows from a statement of the form all F's are G. Wonderful. Turns out really difficult to teach kids or even adults who haven't taken a logic class. What we generally use is the generic, right? Ducks lay eggs, tigers have stripes. What a mess. Nobody knows how generics work. There are all kinds of accounts, and maybe some of them are right, but it's just really complicated from a logical point of view. But generics are so useful, and they're so much more useful than full-blown universal quantification for beings like us in sort of ordinary life. And so, of course, that's what kids come up with first. Because, we're sort of, evolution didn't make us be good at conceptual analysis. This is a point Tim Williamson makes, but it gave us the capacities we need to survive. And I think possibility and necessity are a bit like the universal quantifier here. They're really nice and clean concepts that philosophers love to work with. But in real life, what you really need to know is what you're able to do, and not what's possible. So when I went to my office today to do this interview with you, it was really useful that I knew I can walk to the office and I can take my bike to the office. And this may come as a shock to you Americans, I can't drive because I live in a big European city where I don't that's a really useful thing to know, because, if I had tried to drive, that would have ended in disaster. And if I didn't know that I can't fly, that also, I don't know how that would have ended. But if anything we do, any action we successfully perform is going to be guided by some knowledge of what we can and can't do. Very often that knowledge is so implicit and so taken for granted that it sounds even silly sort of bringing up the alternatives. But it's silly because we know that we can't do certain things and we can do others. And so that knowledge is really, really crucial for our actions. That makes it really plausible that we'd have a sort of very reliable mechanism for getting that kind of knowledge that doesn't require the lovely conceptual clarity that our mind may just not have evolved to come up with from the beginning. And so I think we need a sort of sui generis epistemology of ability that doesn't just take on what we have about possibility and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, you provide a new epistemology for ability knowledge, drawing from our experience of our own agency. Could you tell us a bit about the basics of your account and how it differs from other work in modal epistemology?
I guess I've said a little bit already, well, more than a little bit, about how it differs from other work in modal epistemology. It differs primarily in that until very recently, I think there just wasn't any work on ability knowledge except as a sort of sub-case of possibility knowledge. And so, in a way, it just differs from other work in modal epistemology by taking abilities really seriously as sort of their own kind of modal phenomenon. And what I start with in trying to give an epistemology of ability knowledge is something that looks a lot like the T-axiom, but it's not the T-axiom. So it is an inference from actuality, but it's not a logical deductive inference from actuality. And it's not an inference from one-off success, but it's inference from repeated success. So, if I repeatedly succeed at something, it's very reasonable to conclude that I have an ability to do it. And the more complex the thing is, the less likely I would be, right? If I succeed in riding a bike for a kilometer, that would be really hard to explain if I didn't have an ability to do so.
Yeah.
And that already gave away the kind of inference principle that seems to be at work here, which is something like an inference to the best explanation. So, if you see me conversing in fluent French, the best explanation for what I'm doing is that I have part of the best explanation, obviously not the whole, is that I have the ability to speak French. Actually, my French isn't very good, but never mind. Just speak. Okay, so there's that. But I think that that kind of inference has to play a role, but it can't be the whole story, because I introduced abilities by setting them apart from dispositions. And this kind of inference to the best explanation would work equally well for dispositions, right? And if somebody keeps getting angry, we can infer that they're probably irascible. If I keep eating the chocolate that's put in front of me, you can infer that I have a certain disposition to overeat on chocolate. So, my track record of success, or of course failure in the case of inability, that helps me know about my abilities, but it doesn't seem enough to produce knowledge of ability as opposed to some other kind of modal property. Ability seems to be really closely related to our agency. And so I think we also need to look to our agency to think about the epistemology of ability. Now, we have ways of tracking our own agency, and it's really complicated, but I think it's really clear we have it. It's not really clear how it works, or at least it's controversial how it works. That's my sense. But what we do, we have a range of what's sometimes called agentive phenomenology, right? So when we do something, it just feels differently from something happening to us. And it's sort of easiest to bring this out if it's the same kind of bodily movement. It feels really different to kick your leg forward than to sort of have your leg kick forward by the, what's it called, patella reflex, the kind of reflex where you sort of hit on the knee. And so the feeling that sets apart an action from something that merely happens to you is sometimes called a sense of agency. And there's lots of research on it. There's some research on how it works at the sort of neurological level, and there's, different kinds of, there's work on different aspects of it. So some of the most useful work, for my purposes anyway, was due to Elisabeth Pachery, who distinguishes between different aspects in the sense of agency. There's the sense of initiating the action, and there's the sense of sort of guiding the action to its outcome. Other people have written on effort, which is, of course, you can think of effort as just sort of something on a more objective level, but it's also something that there's a sense of effort. You feel that, you're really pushing hard and that kind of thing. Okay, so and I think it's those kinds of different aspects of agentive phenomenology that give us also some access to our abilities. So in general, when you do something and you have a sense of agency in it, that's a pretty good guide to the thing you did being an exercise of your ability. And of course, it can't be an exercise of your ability unless you had an ability in the first place. Sense of agency alone can't do it because it doesn't really tell you under what description what you did was an action. So you have a sense of agency, but did you exercise your ability to throw a dart or your ability to hit the bullseye? Who knows? So sort of keeping your track record in mind still is really important to sort of modulate, as it were, the abilities you sort of find yourself having. So that sounds like it's an account with two components, but I think really when we look at them more close, so one component obviously being the track record and the other one the agentive phenomenology. But I think when we look more closely at how these things work, these two components are actually really closely related. And this is the last thing I'm going to say. Because when we think about our abilities and how we come to have, let me start again. Mm-hmm. We can see how closely integrated these two elements are by thinking about the acquisition of abilities themselves. So it may be that we're born with some basic abilities, but actually most of the abilities we take to be basic as adults are also acquired, right? Mm-hmm. Abilities in the sort of sense we're interested in, where it's really to do with action. Even something like the basic action of moving a finger in a certain way. If you've ever watched an infant, they put a lot of practice into those things. Mm-hmm. Not to mention stuff like walking, but even like, I remember how proud I was the first time my son held a rattle. Right. Then he didn't know how to let go of it. So, even things that we think of as really basic abilities are actually acquired through a lot of practice, just really, really early in life.
Yeah.
And now if we think about that, the acquisition of an ability through practice, that provides us with so much information, right? So let's think about a slightly less basic case. Let's take riding the bicycle again. So let's think about a kid learning to ride the bicycle. They try, they fail, they try again, it goes a bit better, they try again, and suddenly it keeps going, and so on and so forth. And in the course of learning to ride a bicycle, they basically acquire all the information. They're sort of getting their track record. It gets better. Yeah. And also, it is through learning to do the thing that they learn, as it were, to feel a sense of agency over it, precisely because, and the neurocognitive stuff that we know sort of can tell us something about that, but our sense of agency also doesn't sort of pop up. It's something that gets developed through the sort of experiences we make. And so it's precisely the experiences we make in acquiring an ability that provide us with both the track record and develop the sense of agency sort of in with the same kind of process. So that actually also explains why it's so easy to have knowledge of our own abilities, because it just comes for free, at least with abilities, well, when they're with general and global abilities, to use my earlier distinction. Yeah. It sort of comes for free just from learning the ability. That, by the way, is also why I think it's general and global abilities that are prior in our knowledge, because we have these really reliable processes for acquiring knowledge of them, as it were, for free, just by acquiring the abilities themselves. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of really interesting work in developmental psychology that tells us more about how little kids do just that. Yeah. And so that would be my epistemology of ability. And then there's a whole other story on how we get from there to knowledge of, the standard modalities. But that is how I think it works with abilities, and that I think is the starting point for thinking about modality.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Barbara. This has been excellent. Mm-hmm. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
I have a website that's basically just my name. So it's www.barbaravetter.de. The DE stands for Germany. And most of my papers and so on are on there. You can also just look up my profile on PhilPeople, which has preprints of pretty much everything. And of course, there's the website of the Center of Advanced Studies that I'm running here, Human Abilities. And again, that's just www.human-abilities.de. Again, the DE for Germany. And on all of these websites, I think you can find a lot more about the stuff we talked about.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks again.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah. In our next episode, we'll talk about the structure of agency, and our guest will be Joshua Shepherd, a career research professor at the Autonomous University of Barcelona.